بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. As Brother Musallai mentioned, we have several occasions these days, and tonight's lecture is dedicated to Imam Al-Hadi alayhi salam, and the discussion is about the role of the relationship between reason and faith as understood from the advices and the practices of Imam Al-Hadi alayhi salam. Let me start with a very brief introduction. So the debate about the relationship between faith and intellect, faith and reason, is one of the most prevalent debates in different ages among different faiths, and there are different perspectives on how faith and reason are related to one another. For example, in the age of modernity, people like Freud, they projected the idea that there is a kind of contrast between reason and faith, and although faith contributed to human in the course of history, however, when we are coming to the age of modernity, is a decline of religion, which is going to be replaced by intellect. Faith is going to be replaced by reason. So the idea of enchantment and disenchantment, that the world and the history until the age of modernity has been enchanted by faith, but intellect comes to save humanity and disenchant the whole world and the history. This is also related to the secularization thesis, which, as I indicated elsewhere, has been proved to be a false thesis due to having undeniable proofs of the continuous significant role of faith and religion in the lives of the people, not only in the age of modernity, but afterwards and even today. So some, they believed in a kind of contrast between faith and reason. There are others who try to distinguish the domain of faith and the domain of reason. For example, Catholicism in Middle Ages, when, for example, when you read the works of someone like Saint Augustine, when he discusses the concept of Trinity, and he acknowledges some of the difficulties, rational difficulties in accepting Trinity. So he ends with saying, this is the domain of faith, not the reason. So if you're a Christian, you believe in Trinity. And that shows your devotion, that you believe in something that your intellect cannot accept it. That's another approach. And a similar approach can be seen in the late 20th century, as some scholars, especially the proponents of the phenomenological approach to the study of religion, they presented the idea that religion is a sui generis. In other words, religion is a different phenomena, something that you cannot study it with other sciences, something that has its own terminology, has its own domain. Somehow they try to negate the critical approaches of philosophical, psychological, or sociological approaches to a study of religion. So some believed in a contrast between faith and reason. Some believed in a kind of separation between faith and reason. And some others, for example, in Islamic theology, among the in Sunni theology, especially in Ash'arite approach to Islamic theology and Ahlul Hadith, although they didn't reject right away the role of the reason, however, they limited the role of the reason to kind of marginal role, just to confirm what the shara, what the rule of Quran, the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. So reason is not independent, according to them, in understanding what is wrong or what is right. Rather, it follows what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says is right or wrong. But that's a detailed discussion. I can't enter it right now. But when it comes to Shiites and Mu'tazilites, which somehow we don't have Mu'tazilites nowadays as a theological school as it is abundant a few centuries ago. However, still its impact can be seen. So for Shia, the relationship between reason and faith is different. It is the kind of the principle called al-Qa'idatul Mulazamah. The principle that says we have it in theology, in Shia theology, in Usul al-Fiqh. It says كل ما حكم به العقل حكم به الشرع. Whatever reason commands, religion also commands. وكل ما حكم به الشرع حكم به العقل. And whatever religion commands, intellect also commands the same point, which shows the kind of understanding that there is an intertwined relationship between reason and faith, and one cannot go against the other. And coming to the discussion tonight, the topic of our discussion tonight, we can see in the life of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, this relationship between faith and reason, this intertwined relationship is being emphasized. And Imam emphasizes on the crucial rule of reason in the domain of faith as a criterion to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong. To elaborate on this discussion, let me mention some of the characteristics of the age that Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam was living in. Some of the challenges that Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam was facing at his time. First, the age of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, the age that Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam was ruling the Shia community, was the time of the Abbasid rule, and it was al-Mutawakkil was the Abbasid Caliph at the time of Imam Al-Hadi alayhi salam. And Mutawakkil gave unprecedented power to Hanbalis. So among the four school of jurisprudence in Sunnah school of thought. So we have Hanbalis, we have Hanafis, Malikis, and Shafi'is. Hanbalis are the ones that are known to be the most traditionalist. Their approaches to understanding Quran, understanding Hadith is very text-centered. They are in some understanding, they are being known as literalists. So they put a lot of emphasis on Hadith, a lot of emphasis on reports, and following them exactly, not going deep into kind of rational or philosophical discussions about what it means. So you see, for example, the Wahhabi approach to theology, which is Wahhabi, they consider themselves as Hanbalis. So you see, for example, if there is a verse of Quran saying that إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى الْعَرْشِ اسْتَوَى, Allah is sitting on his throne. So for Wahhabis, it means that exactly the same as the words literally can be translated. Allah has a throne on which he is sitting. Yadullah fawqa aydihim. The hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above all hands. So for Shias, for other Muslims, the understanding is that it's the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But you look at the Wahhabi exegesis of Quran, they say, this is the exact words, which means God and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a hand, God forbid it. So has a hand over all other hands. But there is a hand. What type of hand? We don't know. There is a كمثله شيء. But this is the kind of traditionalist, the kind of literalist approach to text. At the time of Imam Al-Hadi alayhi salam, you see this kind of ideology is being supported, populated, and you see that the people, they are following the same path, following blindly any report and hadith they hear claim to be from the Prophet, and they just try to practice it without being concerned so much about what this practice means, whether it makes sense rationally, so on and so forth. Let me give you an example. In a book called Al-Aghani, Abi Faraj al-Isfahani, he mentions a story. The story is about the time of the Imam al-Jawad and close to the time of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, which shows the kind of atmosphere at the time. It says that someone called Uthman al-Warraq, he says, I saw a famous poet called al-Atabi. I saw him eating bread in the public passage, which was somehow against the social etiquette at the time. So Uthman al-Warraq says, I told Atabi, why you are doing this? Aren't you ashamed of doing this in the public eye? And then Atabi answers, if you go to, for example, your house and you are, for example, in front of you, there are some animals like cows. Do you feel embarrassed to eat in front of them? And they look at you? Osman says, no, but what's the relationship? What do you mean by that? Then Atabi says, wait, I will prove to you that these people, they don't understand anything, and they don't care. They are also like those animals. They follow whatever they hear. They are not the type of people who have this kind of insight or who care what I do. Then, to prove his point, he stands and starts lecturing people. فوعظ وقص ودعا حتى كثر الزحام. So people gathered around. Then he fabricated a hadith. قال لهم روى لنا غير واحد. Many people, they narrated أنه من بلغ لسانه أرنبة أنفه لم يدخل النار. Whoever his tongue touches his nose, he will not enter the hell. So the story says that everyone among the people who were listening to him started checking whether the tongue can touch the top of the nose. So then Atabi, the poet, returned to Uthman al-Warraq. Didn't I tell you that's the case? So this is just a touch, just an example to show the mentality, the atmosphere at the time, that the people were just following whatever they were told to be a report or a hadith without using intellect. Intellect has no role in filtering, in evaluating those kind of hadiths or those kind of reports. The second challenge that Imam al-Hadi was facing at the time was those deviated ideologies of groups like Ghulat, who claim that Imams are divine and they are the prophets, for example. So this Ghulat claim that we are the representative of the Imams who are divine. So we are the prophet of the Imams. We are the prophet of divines. Or some of the invented practices of Sufis at the time, which started to replace the fundamental practices of Islam, like prayers, like recitation of Quran. And the third challenge was this kind of theological debates, those kind of theological inquiries, questions, doubts that rooted in philosophical thoughts that was becoming prevalent at the time after the translation of Greek philosophy and other works. So there were questions circulating among the people, questioning the fundamentals of Islamic thought using philosophical approaches. So the question is how Imam alayhi salam, Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, tried to address the challenges. My argument is that Imam alayhi salam addressed these three challenges, among others, by emphasizing on the role of reason as the only appropriate criterion to distinguish between what is right and true about religion and what is wrong, what is fabricated and must be avoided. For example, there's a hadith that someone called Ibn Sakit. Ibn Sakit, he was one of the famous scholars of language, philologists. And he was also Shia from the companions of Imam al-Jawad, Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam. He was a well-known scholar. He comes to Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam asking a question. Oh Imam, why is that we see there is differences in the type of miracles bestowed upon the prophets? You see that, for example, Musa having a stick that turns to, for example, a snake, some says, or to something else, and see, for example, that Isa, he has the ability to cure some kind of illnesses. And then we have the Prophet of Islam who has Quran as his miracle. It's a kind of speech, kind of wording. So what's the reason that the type of the miracles differ? Imam al-Hadi answers that the reason is that each time and each period in which the Prophet they started their mission is different from the other, and the requirements are very different as well. So at the time of the Musa, it was the case that the magic was prevalent at the time. And for a miracle to be effective, it had to be something that was trend at its time. So it was a kind of magical uh, power given to Musa. At the time of the Isa, it was the medicine that was prevalent, and people were struggling with different diseases. So the most effective miracle was the uh, the power Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Prophet Isa to cure sick people. But at the time of the Prophet of Islam, it was the literacy, it was the literature, it was the speech and the eloquency that was being regarded as the art of the time, at least in the Arabic Peninsula. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave a miracle in line with the trend of the time. So the answer was very effective to Ibn Sakit, and he said, wow, such a great answer. I never saw someone like you who knows how to respond to these questions. And then he asked something. Oh Imam, فما الحجة على الخلق اليوم? What is the solid, undeniable proof that we can use today for people? What is the hujjah? What is that decisive evidence, proof? Imam Ali responds, al-aql, it is the intellect. يعرف به الصادق على الله فيصدقه والكاذب على الله فيكذبه. It is the intellect that can determine who is liar and who tells the truth about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's the intellect who can know the one who tells the truth, so the intellect would approve, would confirm, and the one who tells lies, the intellect would reject. So you see, Imam alayhi salam puts intellect, puts reason as the criterion to save people from the deviations, from the ideological deviations, from the superstition that was becoming prevalent at the time. For Imam alayhi salam, reason is not separate from faith. Reason is not contrasting faith. Rather, reason is intertwined with faith. Reason is the criterion of faith. Let me give you some examples from the life of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, from the advices of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, that shows and proves this approach, this rational approach that Imam is taking. As I mentioned, so one of the challenges at the time was the challenge of superstitions. because of the literal approach of Hanbalis, putting a lot of emphasis on hadiths without necessarily evaluating the authenticity of them. So it became a kind of atmosphere at the time that people started believing in many of superstitions, including the kind of the ideas about certain days, certain times, certain numbers, certain people being unlucky and ominous. So, for example, the number 13 is an unlucky number, even we have it today. So, Imam alayhi salam started to stand against this kind of deviations, this kind of baseless claims that were ascribed to religion. So, in one of the hadith, someone named al-Hasan ibn Mas'ud, he says that I entered on Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam وقد نكبت إصبعي وتلقاني راكب وصدم كتفي. So my finger was hurt, and also when I was walking, someone who was riding a horse, for example, he by accident he also hurted me on my shoulder. So I was in pain when I entered to in the presence of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam. ودخلت في زحمة فخلق علي بعض ثيابي. Even some of my clothes were ripped because of the accidents. So when I entered the presence of Imam, I said, كفانا الله شرك من يوم فما عيشمك. Allah protect me against you the unlucky day. How ominous you are. What kind of bad day you are that I'm having. And Imam alayhi salam, the moment he heard Hassan ibn Mas'ud saying this, Imam reacted. فقال لي يا حسن هذا وأنت تغشانا ترمي بذنبك من لا ذنب له. You are coming to us and then you blame something that doesn't have any fault. You blame for something happened to you, something that is innocent, something that doesn't have any role, any fault in this. How you blame a day for something happened to you? What's the crime? What's the fault of the day? Then Hassan says, actually, the advice of the Imam made me think for a moment and realize my mistake. Then he says, I told to Imam, Ya Mawlai, astaghfirullah. Then Imam, I asked for Allah's forgiveness. Imam continued explaining to Hassan, Ya Hassan, ما ذنب الأيام حتى صرتم تتشأمون بها إذا جوزيتم بأعمالكم فيها. What's the fault of the days? If you are being punished for something you have done, for example, in those days, is it the fault of the days that something happens to you? Then Hassan says again, أنا أستغفر الله أبدا وهي توبتي يا ابن رسول الله. I realized my mistake and I ask Allah for forgiveness. Imam says, Imam explains that these kind of ideas, this kind of the superstitions, they do not benefit you. والله ما ينفعكم. They do not benefit you. ولكن الله يعاقبكم بذمها على ما ذم ما لا ذم عليها فيه. However, by saying this, you are responsible for what you said and it was wrong. You blame something. You blame a time. You blame someone for something happened to you. Why they have no role in it? And Imam reminds his companion that everything happens in this world. It is in the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only to let it happen or to prevent it. يا حسن أن الله هو المثيب والمعاقب والمجازي بالأعمال عاجلا وعاجلا. And then he advises again, just emphasizing, insisting again and again to make sure that his companion understand it is the wrong approach. He says, لا تعد ولا تجعل الأيام صنعا في حكم الله. Don't repeat this mistake again. And don't give a role to times in what happens to you. They are blameless. They have no role in this. So this is one of the examples. Another example we have in some narrations is that someone, it was at the time, it was the idea that the last Wednesday of a month is unlucky. If you start something there and in the last Wednesday of a time, of a week, of a month, sorry, if you start an action on the last Wednesday of a month, most probably you will fail. You will not succeed in your aim, in your purpose, because it's an unlucky day to start an action. So someone comes to the Imam asking, oh Imam, is it okay if I start something in Al-Ba'a ala Yadur in Wednesday, on the last Wednesday of the month? Imam says, yes, it is okay. And even you will be rewarded for that. Because when you do this, you are standing against this superstition circulated among the people. And Imam says, when you do that, I guarantee that Allah would bless the practice, whatever you start in that day. Because by doing this, you are standing against this wrong idea, this superstition. So you see that Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam pays a lot of attention to fighting superstition, to emphasizing and bolding the role of reason. Because as intellectuals, if it was not even, there was no religious instruction, we can realize that there is no role in time, for the time, in what happens. So times are just some kind of abstract concepts that we humans, when we live in material world, we understand the time. So in an immaterial world, there is no meaning for the time in the sense that we understand it. So for such an abstract concept to have a role in what happens to us, intellect rejects it. And Imam alayhi salam wants to emphasize the role of intellect here. That intellect would tell you that it doesn't matter whether you start on Monday or Tuesday. So the days by themselves, they don't have an impact as a time on whether the success or the failure of an action. You see also this approach of Imam, this intellectual and rational approach of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, when he contrasts those deviated ideologies circulated in his time. As I mentioned, one of the movements that was prevalent at the time of Imam al-Hadi was the movement of Ghulat, who claimed that Imam is divine. For example, there was someone called Ali ibn Haska al-Qumi. He was one of the Ghulat. So Sahl ibn Ziyad, he says that one of our companions wrote to Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam that, O Imam, someone called Ali ibn Haska, he claims to be one of your followers, And he claims that وَأَنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْأَوَّلُ الْقَدِيمُ. He claims that you are eternal, claims that you are divine. وَأَنَّهُ بَابُكَ وَنَبِيُّكَ. And he is your representative and your prophet. أمرته أن يدعو إلى ذلك. And you commanded him to preach this way. And he claims that ويزعم أن الصلاة والزكاة والحج والصوم كل ذلك معرفته. He claims, prayer, fasting, zakat, charity, hajj, all of them are not but knowing you. Is knowing the Imam, is knowing you as divine, which is the true essence of all of this. So then he claims that he is not obliged anymore to pray or to fast, so on and so forth, because he knows you. And the one who knows you doesn't have anymore to be occupied with these practices. Imam Ali Islam responded to this letter. And Imam Islam said, وَكَذَبَ ابْنُ حَسْكِ عَلَيْهِ لَعَنَهُ اللَّهُ. This person, Ibn Haska, he lied. He is not my representative. Whatever he ascribes to me is lie, and he is far away from Allah's mercy. Well, I don't know him among my followers. And then Imam insists that فوالله ما بعث الله محمدا والأنبياء قبله إلا بالحنفية والصلاة والزكاة والصيام والحج والولاية. Allah didn't send the Prophet Muhammad and the prophets before him, but to preach al-Hanifiyya, to be true servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of us, the Prophet and me and the others, we are merely servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we obey him, we are rewarded, and if we disobey him, we are going to be punished. ما لنا على الله من حجة بل الحجة لله علينا. We don't have anything against Allah, but he is the one who has the power over us. He has proof against us. We are his servants, not anything else. So you see that Imam Ali Islam tries to purify the community by fighting this kind of deviated ideologies. Another example of these deviated ideologies at the time was some of the Sufi movements among the Sunnis, that they tried to replace some of the Islamic teachings with what they claim to be spiritual, replacing prayer and recitation of Quran with dancing and singing, for example. So there is a report. It is ascribed to Sheikh al-Mufid, although there are some concerns about the authenticity of the report, because we couldn't find it in the works of Sheikh al-Mufid. However, the concept seems to be supported by the approach that Imam is taking, and seems to be reliable. And it says that Imam Ali Salam was in the Masjid al-Nabi, in the Mosque of the Prophet, when one of the famous Sufis entered with some of his companions, and he was well known, well respected among the Sufi circles. And they started doing some words, some dhikrs, and so doing their practices. Imam Ali Salam saw that his companions are looking or paying attention. He then warned them, cautioned them, لا تلتفتوا بهؤلاء الخداعين. Don't pay attention to these scams. And then Imam explains that what they do, the practice as kind of the uh, starving themselves, the kind of what they do as kind of wearing very simple and cheap clothes, so on and so forth. Imam says these are all to attract you. There's no deep meaning to it. There's no ikhlas in it, no purified intention in it. And then Imam alayhi salam says, mentions different aspects and mentions أورادهم الرقص والتسدية وأذكارهم الترنم والتغنية فلا يتبعهم إلا السفهاء ولا يعتقدهم إلا الحمقاء فمن ذهب إلى زيارة أحد منهم حيا أو ميتا فكأنما ذهب إلى زيارة الشيطان وعبادة الأوثان. So the point is that Imam alayhi salam here cautions his companions. Again, look at the purified teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Do not try to invent practices. Do not try to do not follow something that you are not certain about. You don't know whether they can be trusted or not. What you need to know is what the Prophet, peace be upon him, explicitly instructed you to follow. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, also, he gave you what you need for your perfection, for a spiritual journey. So we have also the other similar examples that can be seen to help us. They can see that seems to help us understand what is important here. So you see that Imam alayhi salam, so he also tries to address this problem, this challenge of these deviated ideologies by relying on intellect, by relying on the pure teachings of Islam, and warning and cautioning his companions from taking path, those approaches that are not verified. So the unreliable hadiths, unreliable approaches, unreliable practices, and ask their companions to rely on intellect as the true criterion for evaluating what is right and wrong, and to stick with what is confirmed to be from Quranic and the prophetic uh, uh, teachings. Finally, I also mentioned that there are those kind of doubts, those kind of inquiries, questions with philosophical taste, questioning some of the uh, basic teachings of Islam. For example, there were so much discussions about Jabr and Tafwiz, whether we are forced to do something, or whether we are having the total we are the total power over our actions. So are we compelled to do what we do, or are we totally free to do what we do? So this kind of questions we have in Tuhaf al-Uqul, one of the uh, hadith works of the 4th century Hijri, that Imam alayhi salam writes a long letter. It's around 15 pages, answering some kind of questions and doubts about this matter. So Imam alayhi salam says, it's not a matter of being compelled to do something. We are not compelled. It is not jabr. But also we are not totally free to do whatever we want. Rather, is al-manzilatu bayna al-manzilatayn. It's a state between. And he also narrates from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam the same concept. Then, and he explains by narrating from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam that someone asked Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, هل أجبر الله العباد على المعاصي? Did Allah compel people to commit sins? Imam alayhi salam answered, هو أعدل من ذلك. It's Allah is just. It's not something that He would do that. It's against His justice. Then he was questioned, فَهَلْ فَوَّضَ إِلَيْهِمْ? Is it the case that he gave total power, decision to the people to do whatever they want? And then Imam alayhi salam answered, وَأَعَزُّ وَأَقْهَرُ لَهُم مِّن ذَلِكَ. He is much more powerful, and he controls everything. He cannot be, and his authority cannot be undermined by the others. So it is not either jabr, not tafiz. People are not totally, are not compelled to do something and are not totally free. Rather, it's in between. They have their own share of free will to decide, but it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the end who decides everything. So we have our own free will, but it doesn't mean that I can change the whole world the way that I want. My free will has limitations. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who has the sole power over the whole universe. The similar kind of approach you can see in the Imam's response to kind of the questions of Yahya ibn Aktham. Was at the time he was the head of the judges at the time of Ma'mun, and he was very famous as one of the scholars. And he writes a letter to one of the brother of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, Musa ibn Muhammad al-Raza, and he asks some question challenging the knowledge of the Imams. And then Musa ibn Muhammad comes to Imam al-Hadi asking for response. He says, I didn't know how to respond to them. For example, Yahya asked a question. So, for example, in the story of the Asif ibn Barkhia we have in Quran, when Suleiman asked, who can bring the throne of the Queen of Saba here in my presence? So, Quran says, someone who has the ilm min al-kitab, the knowledge of the book, he says, I can bring it before you blink. So then Yahya asks, the Prophet asks someone else to do something, he can't do it. So it means that the Asif had a knowledge that the Prophet of Allah, Musa, didn't have it. How is possible? So a kind of philosophical challenge, rational challenge. Imam answers, in fact, it was Musa who gave Asif the knowledge. Why? Because Musa intended to appoint Suleiman intended to appoint Asif as his representative after his death. So he used the opportunity to demonstrate and show people and prove to people that Asif is worthy of this position. So he had gave Asif this knowledge, and Asif used it on the premise and the permission of Suleiman. So it wasn't the case that Suleiman didn't have the power to do this and Asif was able to do it. Or for example, the last point I mentioned here in the story of the Yusuf, and when Quran says that the Yaqub and the brothers of Yusuf, they prostrated in front of him. So Yahya asked how it is possible that the Prophet prostrates before another Prophet. And Imam alayhi salam responds that it was not the prostration for Yusuf, it was for Allah, and because of the love for Yusuf. So the prostration was for Allah. And then Imam mentioned the verse of Quran about the prostration of angels before Adam. Similarly, it wasn't the prostration for Adam, it was for Allah. And the obligation to Allah's command, but out of respect for Adam. So I'm finishing my lecture tonight by emphasizing that the life of Imam Al-Hadi alayhi salam is a very suitable period to do some research about Imam's approaches, rational approaches, and Imam's emphasis on the role of intellect in understanding the true essence of faith. Because the time was the time that the role of intellect was being undermined. And Imam alayhi salam had this responsibility to revive the role of intellect. So it is something that we need to appreciate. We need to learn from Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, and we need to make sure that our understanding from our faith goes in line with the proper evaluation of our intellect and reason as a criterion for our faith, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the knowledge, gives us the insight to benefit from the wisdom of Ahlul Bayt and to find the proper path, inshallah, in our life. Please recite a salawat.